They say you can't put a price on a human life. But on the coldest Christmas Eve in Chicago's history, a life was measured exactly in crumpled bills and loose change. $8. To most, $8 is a cup of coffee or a quick snack. But for 12-year-old Leo, standing alone in the biting wind, it was everything. It was his breakfast, his lunch, and his only shield against the freezing dark. He was a boy the world had forgotten, invisible and small. But that night, when a terrifying stranger fell at his feet, Leo made a choice that would shake the snow off the rooftops. He proved that you don't need a mansion to offer shelter, and you don't need to be big to be a hero. This is the story of how a homeless boy saved a beast, and how an army of iron giants returned the favor. It is proof that sometimes, the smallest hands can lift the heaviest burdens. The weatherman on the crackling radio inside the gas station called it the storm of the century. But for 12-year-old Leo, standing outside in oversized sneakers, it just felt like another night of survival. The wind in Chicago didn't just blow, it bit. It gnawed at the exposed skin of his wrists where his sleeves were too short and whipped his thin, donated coat around his small frame like a tattered flag. But Leo barely noticed the freezing gust that nearly knocked him over. His entire world was focused on the sensation in his right pocket, the solid, metallic weight of exactly $8. He took the bills and coins out one last time, shielding them from the flying snow with his body to count them. 5 ones, wrinkled and soft from too much handling. 8 quarters, 5 dimes, and a handful of nickels. He had spent 3 days scouring the gutters and trash cans of the South Side, collecting bottles and running errands to gather this. To anyone else driving by in their heated cars, it was pocket change. To Leo, it was a ticket to another sunrise. Inside, Mike's stop. The fluorescent lights hummed with a promise of warmth that made his chest ache. He could see the steam rising from the hot food counter, the rotisserie rollers turning slowly with sausages, the pot of chili bubbling near the coffee station. Leo pressed his small hand against the glass, his breath instantly fogging the pain. Mike, the owner, looked up from his magazine behind the counter. He was a man with a thick neck and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He saw the boy and his expression hardened, not with malice, but with a tired annoyance that was somehow worse. He pointed a meaty finger at the no loitering sign taped to the door and made a sharp shooing motion. "Storm's coming, kid. Move it along." Mike shouted through the glass, his voice muffled but the message clear. He reached up and turned the lock with a sharp click. The sound echoed in Leo's ears louder than the wind. He stepped back, the rejection stinging more than the ice pellets hitting his face. He retreated to the edge of the lot, near the broken air pump, huddling behind a concrete pillar to escape the wind. The temperature was dropping fast. The radio had said 20 below zero with wind chill. Leo looked down at his sneakers. The canvas was soaked through, and his toes had stopped hurting an hour ago, which he knew was a bad sign. If he stayed out here tonight, he wouldn't just be cold. He would sleep, and he wouldn't wake up. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He looked back at the station. He had money. He was a paying customer. He just needed to be brave. He clutched the wadded bills in his fist, steeling himself to beg Mike for just 10 minutes of warmth, maybe a cup of hot water. He pushed himself off the pillar, his legs stiff, and took a step toward the entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs. Just as he reached for the door handle, a blinding headlight cut through the swirling snow, followed by the deafening roar of a monstrous engine that shook the pavement beneath his feet. A massive chrome motorcycle skidded into the lot, its rider looking more like a beast than a man under the flickering neon lights. The machine was a monster of steel and noise, ticking loudly as the engine died, the heat from its exhaust pipes creating a shimmering mirage that distorted the falling snow. The rider swung a heavy boot over the seat and planted it on the ice with a crunch that sounded like breaking bones. He stood up, unfolding to a height that seemed to block out the street lamps. He was clad in black leather that creaked with every movement, his vest adorned with patches that Leo couldn't read but knew meant trouble. A thick, gray beard covered half his face, and his arms, bare despite the freezing temperature, were tapestries of ink depicting skulls and daggers. Leo shrank back into the shadows of the air pump, trying to make himself invisible. Just moments ago, Mike had looked at Leo with a sneering annoyance, like one looks at a stray cat. But as Leo glanced toward the glass doors now, he saw Mike's expression had shifted entirely. The annoyance was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated fear. Mike had backed away from the counter, his hand hovering near the phone, his eyes wide and fixed on the giant outside. It was the primal reaction of prey recognizing a predator. The hierarchy of the street was clear. Leo was at the bottom, Mike was in the middle, and this leather-clad giant was at the very top. The biker took a step toward the store, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement. He looked unstoppable, a force of nature that the storm itself had spit out. But then the impossible happened. The giant stumbled. It wasn't a slip on the ice. It was a sudden, violent shudder that racked his entire massive frame. His hand, the size of a catcher's mitt, shot up to clutch his chest, his fingers digging into the leather vest as if trying to rip his own heart out. A guttural groan escaped his lips, a sound of agony that cut through the whistling wind. "Meds a bag." He wheezed, the words barely audible. His knees buckled. The man who looked like he could wrestle a bear collapsed hard onto the unforgiving concrete, landing flat on his back. His eyes rolled back and his skin, previously flushed from the wind, turned a terrifying shade of ash gray. He lay there, gasping like a fish thrown onto a dock, his chest heaving in shallow, desperate bursts. The silence that followed was heavy. Leo stood frozen, his heart pounding against his ribs. He looked at the gas station door. Mike cracked it open just an inch, the chain lock still engaged. "Hey!" Leo shouted, pointing at the fallen man. "Help him. He's dying." Mike looked down at the biker, then at Leo, his face twisted in disgust. "Are you crazy, kid? Look at him. That's an iron Spartan. They're nothing but trouble." Mike hissed through the crack, his breath puffing out in white clouds. "Probably overdosed on something. I'm not unlocking this door for a ganger. Let nature take its course. Just walk away, boy, before the cops get here." Mike slammed the door shut and locked it again, retreating to the back of the store. Leo was left alone with the dying man and the snow. He looked down at the biker. Up close, the man didn't look like a monster anymore. He looked terrified. He looked human. Leo's hand went into his pocket, his fingers wrapping around the wadded bills. $8. It was a hot meatball sub. It was a large coffee. It was permission to sit inside for an hour. It was his life. If he spent this now, he would be hungry. He would be cold. He might not survive the night. "Walk away," a voice in his head whispered. "Mike is right. It's not your problem. You have to survive." Leo took a step back toward the street. He gripped the money tighter. But then he looked at the man's hand. It was reaching out, fingers trembling, grasping at the empty air, searching for help that wasn't coming. Leo thought of his mother, how she used to share their last piece of bread with the birds on the windowsill, even when her own stomach rumbled. "We are poor in pocket, Leo," she had told him, "but we must never be poor in spirit." Tears stung Leo's eyes, hot and angry. He looked at the warm, glowing food counter inside, realizing he was saying goodbye to it. He looked at the man gasping on the ice. The calculation was simple and cruel, his comfort for this stranger's life. He let out a frustrated scream, a sound of pure sacrifice. Disregarding Mike's shouting, Leo slams his $8 onto the counter and screams, "Aspirin and water." Now, $8 didn't seem like much to the world, but as the coin slid across the counter, Leo felt like he was paying with pieces of his own soul. He didn't just hand the money over. He shoved it toward Mike with a desperation that shook his entire small body. The bills were crinkled and damp from his sweat, the quarters clinking loudly against the linoleum. Mike looked at the pile of cash, then at the bottle of aspirin and the water Leo had grabbed from the shelf. For a second, Leo thought the man might show a shred of mercy, might tell him to keep the money since it was an emergency. But Mike just scoffed, his eyes devoid of charity, and swept the coins into the register drawer with a greedy scrape. "Receipts in the bag," Mike muttered, turning his back as if the transaction was nothing more than a sale of cigarettes. He took the money with a sneer, unaware that this transaction was being watched by fate and that karma has a long memory. Leo didn't wait for the receipt. He didn't wait for permission. He tore the cap off the water bottle with his teeth as he sprinted back out into the biting wind. The snow was falling harder now, covering the fallen biker in a shroud of white, making him look like a fallen statue. Grizz was barely moving, his chest hitching in shallow, terrifying spasms. His skin was clammy and cold to the touch when Leo dropped to his knees beside him, the icy slush soaking instantly through his jeans. Hey, look at me, Leo yelled over the howling wind, his voice cracking. He twisted the cap off the aspirin bottle, his fingers numb and clumsy. He shook 2 pills into his palm. I need you to chew these. Can you do that? You have to chew. Grizz's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. He looked up and for a moment, he didn't see a homeless kid in rags. He saw a lifeline. He tried to speak, but only a gargled wheeze came out. He parted his lips slightly, and Leo placed the bitter tablets onto the man's tongue. Come on, big guy. Chew, Leo commanded, holding the water to Grizz's bearded lips. The giant obeyed. He chewed slowly, wincing at the taste, and Leo carefully tipped the water into his mouth, making sure he didn't choke. Stay with me, Leo whispered, one hand resting on the leather vest that smelled of gasoline and old tobacco, the other gripping the man's freezing shoulder. You're not gonna die tonight. Not on my watch. Minutes felt like hours. Slowly, the color began to return to Grizz's face, not much, but enough. His breathing deepened, the terrifying gasps smoothing out into a rhythm. He blinked, clearing the fog from his vision, and locked eyes with Leo. It was a look of profound confusion and recognition. He saw the oversized coat, the shivering frame, the determined eyes of a child who had no business being a hero. He saw the empty aspirin bottle in the snow. Then, the wail of sirens cut through the storm. Blue and red lights bounced off the snowdrifts as an ambulance skidded into the lot. 2 paramedics jumped out, bags in hand, rushing toward them. Move back, kid. Give us room, one of them shouted, gently but firmly pushing Leo aside. Leo stumbled back, falling onto his rear in a snowbank. He watched as they swarmed the biker, checking vitals, shouting medical terms, and loading the massive man onto a stretcher. As they lifted him, Grizz fought against the oxygen mask strapped to his face. He turned his head, his eyes searching frantically until they found Leo again. He reached out a heavy tattooed hand, his fingers extending toward the boy in a silent plea, a promise, a thank you. But he was too weak to speak. We're moving. Go, the paramedic yelled. They shoved the stretcher into the back of the rig. The doors slammed shut, severing the connection. The engine revved, tires spinning for a second before catching traction. The ambulance sirens fade into the night, leaving Leo alone in the dead silence of the blizzard, penniless, hungry, and colder than ever before. The silence that followed the ambulance was heavier than the snow. It was the suffocating weight of being completely and utterly alone. Leo stood in the fading red glow of the taillights until they disappeared into the swirling white void, taking the only warmth he had known all night with them. He reached into his pocket out of habit, his frozen fingers seeking the familiar, sharp edges of the coins he had guarded for days. But the comforting clink of the coins was gone, replaced by a biting emptiness that seemed to spread from his pocket straight to his heart. He was broke. He was exposed. And the storm was no longer a threat. It was a sentence. The fluorescent lights of the gas station flickered once, then died. Leo spun around to see Mike flipping the neon open sign to dark. The owner locked the heavy glass doors with a rattle of keys that sounded like a jail cell closing. He spotted Leo standing by the pumps, a small, trembling shadow against the driving snow. For a fleeting second, Mike hesitated, his hand on his truck door. But then he shook his head, muttering something about liability and street rats, and climbed into his warm cab. He drove off, leaving Leo in absolute darkness. Not my problem, the wind seemed to whisper, mimicking Mike's voice. Leo stumbled toward the alleyway behind the station, his legs stiff and uncooperative. The wind here was a physical force, pushing him down, but he found a discarded refrigerator box wedged between the dumpster and the brick wall. It was damp at the bottom, but it was a shield. He crawled inside, curling into the tightest ball possible, tucking his hands into his armpits and burying his face in his knees. His teeth chattered so violently his jaw ached. He tried to summon warm memories, the smell of his mother's cocoa, the radiator in their old apartment, but the cold was a thief, stealing his thoughts one by one. Time lost its meaning. The shivering, which had been painful, began to slow down. Leo knew what that meant. His body was giving up. He wondered if the biker had lived. He wondered if anyone would find him when the snow stopped. He should have been angry at Mike, angry at the world, angry that his kindness had cost him his life. But as his eyelids grew heavy, he only felt a strange, detached peace. "Mom, I tried," he whispered into the wind, his breath forming a weak cloud that froze instantly on the cardboard. He closed his eyes, drifting into a dangerous sleep, dreaming of a warm fire that wasn't there. Morning breaks with a blindingly bright sun reflecting off the snow. Leo is still, covered in a layer of frost. Suddenly, the ground begins to vibrate. It wasn't an earthquake that shook the icicles off the roof. It was the synchronized roar of 100 Vietwin engines announcing their arrival. The sound vibrated through the frozen cardboard box, rattling Leo's bones and jolting him from his stupor. He peeled his eyes open, his eyelashes heavy with frost, to see the world transformed. The blizzard had vanished, replaced by a blindingly clear, blue Christmas morning sky. But beneath that serene sky, a black tide of steel was rolling down the street, engulfing the gas station in a cloud of exhaust and chrome. Leo struggled to sit up, his limbs stiff and unresponsive. Through the gap between the dumpster and the wall, he watched with wide, terrified eyes. The motorcycles didn't stop coming. 10, 20, 50, 100. They circled the lot like a pack of mechanical wolves, their engines growling in a low, menacing harmony that made the windows of the store rattle in their frames. Neighbors across the street were peeking through drawn curtains, doors bolting shut all down the block. Mike burst out of the gas station door, his hands raised in surrender, his face drained of all color. Last night, he had threatened to call the police on a helpless boy. Now, faced with a true force, he crumbled. He looked frantically from rider to rider, searching for mercy. When his eyes landed on the alleyway where Leo was hiding, panic seized him. It was him. The kid. Mike screamed, pointing a trembling finger toward the dumpster. "He did something to your boss. I told him to leave. I didn't touch him. It was the street rat." The bikers ignored Mike completely, as if he were nothing more than a stain on the concrete. The engines cut out in unison, plunging the street into a sudden, ringing silence. The riders dismounted, men and women in heavy leather vests, faces hardened by the wind, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. They formed a path, parting like the Red Sea. From the back of the formation, a familiar figure walked through. It was Grizz. He looked different than the dying man from the night before. His color had returned, and he moved with the power of a mountain. Grizz walked past Mike without even a glance, his heavy boots crunching on the fresh snow. He headed straight for the alley. Leo tried to scramble backward, pressing his spine against the rough brick wall, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He thought he had killed the man. He thought this was punishment. The giant shadowed him, blocking out the sun, his imposing silhouette looming over the small, shivering boy. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for the anger. The silence stretched, unbearable and electric. Then, he heard the sound of leather straining and a soft thud in the snow. Grizz slowly drops to one knee in the wet snow, ruining his expensive pants, and looks Leo in the eye with a gentle smile. "I believe I owe you some change, little man." The big man didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a hand warm, calloused, and open in friendship. Leo stared at the open palm, trembling not from the cold anymore, but from shock. He reached out, his small, frost-bitten fingers engulfed by Grizz's massive grip. With a gentle tug, the biker pulled Leo out of the snow and onto his feet. The boy stood unsteady, looking up at the man he had saved, realizing that the terrifying giant was looking back at him with eyes full of fatherly pride. "You gave your last pennies to save a stranger," Grizz announced, his deep voice booming across the silent parking lot so that Mike, standing by the pumps, and every neighbor peeking through their windows could hear. You faced the storm with nothing but courage. The Iron Spartans don't forget debts. And kid, I owe you a big one. Grizz snapped his fingers. Two other bikers stepped forward. One held a heavy leather jacket, shrunk down to a size that might almost fit Leo. It was thick, lined with fur, and had a patch on the chest that read Little Spartan. Grizz draped it over Leo's shoulders, the weight of it feeling like a warm hug. Armor, Grizz said with a wink. For the cold. Another biker wheeled out a brand new mountain bike, its paint gleaming metallic blue in the sun. Leo's jaw dropped. He had never owned anything new in his life. But Grizz wasn't done. He reached into his vest and pulled out a thick envelope. He knelt down again, his expression serious. The bike is for fun. The jacket is for warmth. But this, Grizz tapped the envelope against Leo's chest, this is for your life. It's enrollment papers for the Legacy Academy. It's a boarding school we support. Full scholarship. 3 hot meals a day. And a room of your own. Grizz paused, his voice cracking slightly. You have a home now, Leo. You never have to sleep in a box again. Leo looked at the papers, then at Grizz, then at the empty alleyway that had almost been his tomb. The reality hit him like a physical wave. No more cold. No more hunger. No more being invisible. The tears came then hot, fast, and unstoppable. He didn't say a word. He just buried his face in Grizz's chest. The giant wrapped his arms around the boy, patting his back awkwardly but gently. Behind them, the engine of every motorcycle revved at once, a thunderous, mechanical applause that shook the snow from the trees. Mike, watching from the doorway of his station, lowered his head. He looked at the cash register where Leo's $8 still sat, then turned away, retreating into the shadows of his shop, unable to bear the light of the moment. Ready to go home, son? Grizz asked, handing Leo a helmet. Leo wiped his eyes and nodded. He put the helmet on. It was a little big, but he would grow into it. Leo climbs onto the back of Grizz's bike. As they ride off to his new school, Leo looks back at the empty alley one last time, knowing he never has to return. Leo gave his last $8 to save a man the world told him to fear, proving that the richest heart often beats inside the poorest coat. True kindness isn't about what you have in your pocket, it's about what you have in your soul. When we strip away the labels homeless, biker, stranger, we find that we are all just people waiting for a hand to hold in the storm. So the next time you pass someone by, look a little closer. You never know if you're looking at an angel in disguise, or if they are simply waiting for you to be theirs.